Hi, women of welcome. I am Sarah Casada, and thank you so much for joining on this beautiful Tuesday. There has been a lot of talk in the news about kids and some of the risks that they are facing as our immigration system continues to change and morph. And so we have a really special guest today that I am so excited for you to meet and listen and learn from. I had the privilege of traveling with Jennifer to the border many moons ago, several years pre-pandemic, and she is just a wealth of knowledge and experience, and I learned so much from being in her presence and learning from her. So I'm waiting until she can join us. She works with the organization. Her name is Jennifer Podkul, and she is a vice president at Kids in Need of Defense, which is often shortened to KIND. And they do some incredible work, particularly around providing legal support to children in our immigration system. So, all right, I'm keeping an eye out. You would think after all these years, Instagram would have a little bit of a cleaner way for us to do interviews, but all right, I'll keep sharing a little bit while I wait for her to join. And what we're going to talk about, there's a few things we're going to talk about today. One is you may or may not have seen, oh, here we go. Times article about children being exploited in the workplace in the US. I thought I did it. There we go. Yay.
Hey, Sarah.
Great. I'm so glad you're here.
Nice to see you. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, it's nice to see you too. No, you have so much. I know you are incredibly busy and doing so many things. So it's always such a privilege when you join and speak to our Women of Welcome community, because this issue around immigration and kids is of particular passion and care for many of the women in our community. So we're glad you're here.
Oh, thanks so much. Your community is always so caring for this group of kids. And so we're grateful for the support and the interest in what's happening with them.
Absolutely. So I was just saying that you are a VP at Kids in Need of Defense. Do you want to share just real briefly kind of overall what your organization does? And then we'll jump into some of the things we're going to talk about.
Sure. So we are an international organization that works on behalf of unaccompanied children on the move. And, I say that it's kind of a general term because really what we're looking at is how do we ensure child protection for any child who feels like they can't stay safe where they are and that they need to cross a border to ask and go somewhere else to ask for help and ask for protection. And what we do is we provide them with attorneys to help them through the complex legal procedures. We advocate with governments all over the world, really to ensuring that these kids are protected at moments when they're either crossing borders, if they're in government custody, or while they're trying to integrate into a new community, to make sure that they have a fair process so that we can get to the bottom of a child's story and figure out, do they really need protection somewhere else, or can they safely return back to their country of origin? We have offices all over the United States. We have offices in Mexico, Central America, and we've been expanding actually a lot in Europe lately in response to the Ukraine crisis. And, one thing I'll say is, the majority of our offices are in the United States, but, the issues and opportunities that we see for these kids are really the same anywhere in the world. So we really are trying to always advocate for what's the best thing that we can do to do right by these kids.
I don't think I realized until just now that you guys address this issue internationally. So it's a cliche, but it's such a small world. And so the movement of children around the world it continues to have some similar threads. Such important work. I wanted to start real briefly just defining what we mean when we talk about unaccompanied minors. That's kind of a government word. It's sort of an official title. Do you guys have a definition that you use
Mhm. So there's the legal definition. I don't know if you warned everyone, I'm a lawyer. So I'll start with the law, with the legal definition, and then kind of how it's actually used and what that really looks like on the ground. So legally, it means a child who's encountered without a parent or a legal guardian. So it's a pretty narrow definition, and someone who's under 18. So legally, it's very narrow. So that means some kids are classified as unaccompanied, even if they're traveling with an older sibling or a family member or a grandparent.
I'm so glad you said that. I think that's such a common misconception. When we hear unaccompanied minor, we assume just a child, but you could be with any myriad of family members, but legally you're classified that way without a biological parent or guardian.
Exactly. And oftentimes it's like in that moment of time. So it's at the moment that they present themselves to an official when that designation happens. So you could have a kid who in that moment is by themselves, but then they're going to maybe a trusted aunt or uncle somewhere else, and they'll eventually reunite. So it's kind of in that moment in time. And the reason why that's important is because all these legal procedures start in that moment. And so if a kid is not with a parent or legal guardian, they have to go through this process on their own, make their own case, kind of all these obligations fall on them by themselves. And so what we want to do is make sure that they're given special protections, because even if later they have support from some family member or even a parent later on, they're still on their own kind of doing their case, and what's going to happen to them is just about them. And so it's really important that they get these protections. Now, some of these kids are traveling with family members, right? And they could be with somebody who's been protecting them their whole life and wanting to stay with them. And some of them really are by themselves. As a parent, it's hard to imagine. I still cringe when my daughter wants to walk to Starbucks by herself. But, thinking of these kids going so far on their own. So some really are by themselves. And then some, have some support, whether it's friends or family.
Absolutely. That's so helpful. And just for those that are joining us, welcome. I started and then we joined. I just want to give a little overview of what we're going to talk about. Two primary pieces of news recently. One, there was a New York Times kind of expose on child labor, particularly among migrant children and migrant youth in the US. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we've also been hearing things lately about the return of family detention, possible family separation. And so we're going to talk with Jennifer about that as well. But we're starting out she was just explaining a really great understanding of just unaccompanied minor movement in general. And one thing I just want to connect the dots, because it took me too long to put all of this together. If you're watching and thinking, well, if you've ever watched a crime procedural TV show and you hear like you have the right to remain silent, you have a right to an attorney. One thing I just want to highlight is that because we're talking about migrant children, that is a US citizen right to an attorney. And that, correct me if I'm wrong, Jennifer, but that's where you guys stand in the gap, because children do not necessarily have any representation at their disposal when they're going through these processes.
That's right. Thanks for saying that, Sarah. It's a hard concept for people to even believe that we would have a kid stand by themselves. But immigration, there's no distinction between a kid and an adult in the process. So all the rules, all the requirement, it's all the same for kids, adults. So even a kid, you can have a little one, would have to stand up there by themselves. You have a government attorney in front of the judge and explain why you have the legal right to stay in the United States, or why you would want to ask for protection in the United States. So it's hard for people to believe it. Groups like Kind, we provide kids with attorneys. We get some federal monies. We do some cases. An attorney who might work at a law firm or a corporation might take a case for free. We have some private donations, and that's how we're able to provide kids with lawyers. It's still, I would say, less than half the kids have a lawyer. So more than half the kids are literally standing in front of a judge all by themselves,
So scared.
With really high stakes, right? Not being able to defend themselves, and having to do it on their own.
Wow. All right, so let's jump into this recent story that many of us saw. If you didn't see it and you're watching, it was essentially some investigative reporting, and they were finding story after story after story around the country, different geographies, of migrant youth or migrant kids working in dangerous jobs, working overnight shifts, working on construction crews instead of going to school, some of these kinds of things. And so there was a lot of questions raised about when unaccompanied minors are coming to the US, how are they ending up in these industries? And so Jen, maybe if you can give us a little bit of kind of what is the process or the standard process when a child is arriving in the US, and then kind of what's going on in this situation? How did this happen?
Yeah. So when a kid presents themselves at the border, for example, right, the US government will say, okay, you don't have a visa or you don't have pre-clearance to be here. So immediately we're going to start putting you in deportation proceedings. You need to go prove to a judge why you should stay here. Right. And so, you know, a child, they may go into government custody, and then the government tries to find an adult who will take care of the child while they go through this court process. So you have
is that court process, typically speaking?
It'll take like 5 or 6 years right now because the
I was
so bad. It's a really long period of time. Yeah. So you would have a lot of kids spend about between 20 and 30 days in government custody, and the government's trying to check. They're trying to find an adult who can take care of them, a family member, a family friend, someone will take care of them at no cost to the government, and will help that child then present their case to the judge. So most kids are released from federal custody and go live in someone's home, right? And then they're enrolled in local school, living in communities around the country. But because, to your question, it takes so long for this immigration court process to go on, they don't really have any kind of authorization or permission or papers during that time. They're kind of in this limbo. So they might not have a work permit, but they have a right to go to school. Right, the Supreme Court said they have a right to go to school, so a lot of them should be enrolled in school, right? They might be able to take advantage of other services or community activities, you know, and a lot of them, like any teenager, want to work, right, and have some money. The problem is, without having legal authorization, some of them might not be able to be eligible for a safe, appropriate, and dignified job, right? And so they may be more susceptible to agreeing to take a job that is dangerous or inappropriate, like some of those that were highlighted in that story. The other problem is, like I said, more than half of them don't have a lawyer. They don't have anyone kind of advocating for them that they can talk to and ask questions about what are my rights, what are the processes, what should I be looking for, what are my options. They don't have someone to counsel them for that, right? So attorneys are often called counselors because they actually counsel. They say, here are your options, here are your rights. You have the right, you know, in this state, children are not allowed to be working at your age, or in this state, children are allowed to be working. And in fact, you are eligible for a work permit. Let's get you a work permit so that you can find safe, appropriate work. So a lot of these kids don't have anybody, right? Some of them have pressures. They have family at home who are hungry still, you know, who are actually starving, you know, and they want to be able to help support them. Some of them might have smuggling debts that they need to pay back. And some of them may be living in a home where they're not getting all of their basic needs met, right? The government did a screening to try to make sure that that doesn't happen, but you never really know what's going to happen until a child gets in a home and situations change. So a lot of these kids are in a situation where they're incredibly vulnerable. They don't know what their rights are and can be easily taken advantage of. And this is what we saw in this investigative reporting. I mean, the reporter did an amazing job, but it also has worried me how many kids she found, you know, not that long of a time that she was able to talk to, who ended up in these really exploitative, horrible situations.
I remember reading an article early on in the pandemic that was talking about something similar, because they were saying that so many children who they didn't realize were working overnight shifts in factories and different things, now because of online schooling, were working during the day and logging into class in the break room, and how so many teachers were kind of putting all these pieces together for the first time of why they were always sleepy in class. And it was really heartbreaking. I mean, that's not what you want any child, you know. You want them to have safe, quality education, and be able to be making steps towards their future, and just realizing how common this is, maybe more than we would have known until they put out these kinds of reports.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's a crazy time too, because a lot of business owners and small businesses are looking for workers, right? So it's almost like you have this situation where you have all these kids who are don't know what their options are, want to work, don't know what their rights are, and then you have these unscrupulous employers who are trying to take advantage of that. And you know, I think sometimes people, their eyes glaze over as soon as you start saying like, oh, you need a lawyer, and you know, it seems very complicated, but it really is one of the best tools that we have to make sure that kids understand what their options are, understand what their rights are. And quite frankly, there have been, a lot of these kids are eligible for work permits, right? For the kids who have lawyers, for example, when we are able to represent a case to the very end, from the beginning to the very end, almost always we're winning the cases, right? But that's because we were able to screen the kids and tell the ones who we don't think, have a chance of staying, that maybe they wouldn't win their case, and we can help them go in a return program where they would be safe and supported and reintegrated back into their community and their country of origin. But if these kids are winning their cases and they're eligible for work permits, like, let's make sure they get them, because that's going to be a tool to ensure that they have some of their rights protected, right? That they know what their options are. They're going to be eligible for different kinds of jobs, more appropriate jobs and safe jobs. And then they can also understand, like, what are their options and requirements of going to school? And how would you balance that? If some of them want to earn money, they want to earn it, then let's figure out what would be an appropriate way, and in a way that you can balance it with your educational opportunities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, that's so important. And I think one of the things that stands out to me is, we want a single answer, right? If we do this one thing, it's going to solve this problem. But what I hear you saying is there's kind of a web of support that's needed, both in making sure that kids have access to lawyers who are helping them know their options, but then also that support if it makes the most sense for them to return to their country of origin, or whether they're staying here, and how do they have support in that family structure that they're in and their school system. It's a big pie of support.
Yeah, no, and I like your word web. I was going to say patchwork, but it's like any kid. It really takes a village, right? It's different pieces that all fit together to serve as that protective net for a child. And so, school's part of it, making sure they have a lawyer is part of it, making sure, you're doing this, all of them together, is what's really going to ensure that there's a seamless safety net for these kids. And that governments are working together to really look at what's in the best interest of the child. Having a kid's immigration case go on for 5 or 6 years, that's not good. It's not good for our government, because our government wants to know, who is eligible to stay and who's not eligible to stay. And it's not good for the kid to have to wait 5 or 6 years. They're trying to decide, do I learn English? Do I become integrated in my community? What are my options going to be? How do I see a future for myself? Where is that future going to be? They want to have a solution.
For a child, your life could be completely different if you were 11 and now you're 16, or 16 and now you're 21. I can't do math with the camera at me. That's too much pressure. But that's just really, that's a big gap. It's a big gap for anyone, but especially for adolescents. Like, there's so much that changes. And does their case age out if they cross 18 while they're waiting for their?
No, because like I said, the kid's case and an adult's case, it's the same thing. It's the same standard. It's the same. So in that sense, it does, which is good. But it's hard. It's hard to explain to a judge why you were scared, and why in the mind of a 14-year-old might be scared in a different way than maybe a 20-year-old would be, right? And the judge then has to think about, okay, but when you were 14, like, what information did you have? What tools did you have? What agency did you have to protect yourself? You couldn't work at that age. So it's hard for then somebody to make a case for themselves 6 years later, right? And really try to explain it in a way that the adjudicator would understand.
That makes sense. Well, let's talk a little bit, because we have been seeing some headlines recently, and women in our community have been asking questions, and we on our team have been having different discussions of just trying to understand what may or may not be changing in the short term in regards to the possible return of family detention. What does that mean? And then we're kind of hearing people talk about child separation, family separation, which in 2018, that was a huge headline in this community and really got a lot of women involved in this issue. And so I'm curious how what we're seeing now is the same or different, and what that looks like. So
that's a great question.
And I think questions in one. So take it.
No, but it is really complex. And I think even you asking that question shows a very high level of understanding about how all these things play together. We're talking about, immigration enforcement, but how does that tie to family separation? I can tell you what we've seen at Kind. Like I said, we have offices all over the country and several border offices. Every time there is some sort of border closure or a deterrence policy trying to convince people not to come here asking for protection, we see kids being rendered unaccompanied or separated, right? So for example, Title 42, we see lots of kids getting separated during that policy. During the Remain in Mexico program, lots of kids were separated. When they started applying,
and when you say they were separated, you mean they arrive at the border alone?
They arrive at the border alone. So there's different ways that this happens. Some of them, they were waiting in these dangerous Mexican, northern Mexican towns, and something happened to the parents, and we don't know. And the child then ended up having to walk up to an official by themselves, right? Some of it, we don't know exactly what happened to them. Some of them, they have to make decisions, right? As a parent, I think some parents may have taken the decision, I'd rather you try to be safe than stay here in this dangerous place, right? Being forced to make this terrible decision
because
for the benefit.
Some of them, when those restrictions are in place, sometimes there's an exception for children who are alone, right?
Exactly.
To close the border, and then at different points throughout its iteration, we've said, unless you're a child alone, because we do want children to be safe. I think most people would agree that's a goal to aim for. And so if I'm understanding you correctly, then that puts parents in the decision of, do we all stay here and wait, or do we allow our child to go through alone, because they will be able to possibly get to that family member on the other side?
For the child, a lot of times these kids are making the decision on their own, right? You have teenagers, they're making decisions on their own, sometimes going against the wishes of their parents. These people are being
never thought about that.
Possible decision. Yeah. Now I'm a parent of a teenager, so I understand how to make decisions I don't always agree with in a way that I didn't before. But really, it's kind of a whole host of different situations we're seeing it. But one thing that's consistent, we've tried to been doing an audit of our own cases to say, wow, there really is a connection with every time there's some sort of stick that's put in place trying to convince people not to come here asking for help. We see a spike and a correlation in unaccompanied and separated children, right? And nobody wants anyone to be in this position of having to self-separate or lose contact with your child in the name of immigration enforcement, as opposed to, let's just efficiently get to the bottom of people's stories so we can quickly and fairly figure out who can stay and who does not need protection in the United States and who could safely return. So, this announcement that they're considering using family detention again, we were of course devastated, because representing children, I can tell you, detention is no place for a child, right, ever. And so we were disheartened just thinking of the harm that would cause child. And then also, is this a situation again where we would see some families have to separate, right, because they want to avoid having to go be detained together? And again, over the years, Sarah, we've looked at this over the years and talked about this over the years. The U.S. government keeps trying all these different things. Was it zero tolerance, family separation? Is it closing the border, Title 42? It hasn't stopped people from feeling like they need to come here and ask for help, right? None of it is working, and all this is causing harm. And oftentimes it's kids who get hurt, is what we've seen. So we would much rather have everyone spend the time and the money, because it's a lot of money, all this enforcement for asylum seekers, is let's work with Mexico, let's work with Costa Rica, let's work together with these other countries and make sure we can address any sort of refugee issue together, share the load, share burdens, and so people can stay and be integrated where they are, so that kids stop getting hurt from them.
Yeah. I remember at one point, I don't remember the time. Time is a construct. I have no idea when this happened. Maybe a year ago. I remember reading that there was going to be a little more recognition of, because one of the things I often say is, like, we're addressing a humanitarian issue with a national security response. And so that mismatch kind of hurts people, because it's not necessarily what people are trained to do at the border. And so there was discussion about increased social workers, faster asylum processing. Are you all seeing that happen? That there's sort of been, because 5 or 6 years, that is a long time in limbo, and it's a long time in foster care situations, or all kinds of things happen in 5 to 6 years. Are you seeing any improvement in that?
We are. I will say the government, both Congress and the administration, have been more open to thinking, kind of trying some of our ideas, like having social workers receive kids at the border as opposed to an armed agent with a gun, right? Dealing with the kid and being the one giving them snacks, right? Having a social worker do the interviews so we can get the right information, having the governments work together. There have been some great attempts at piloting these programs to really see how it's going. One of the first times it happened was when all the Afghan evacuees arrived. They actually sent officials from Health and Human Services to help receive people at the airports where people were landing to see maybe this child could stay with this person. They don't have to go into government custody, right? Let's make sure that we're interviewing the child in a child appropriate way so that we can figure out the best placement for them and get them what they need and their services immediately. So it's been great because then we're able to say, okay, this worked, this didn't work as well as we thought, maybe there's another better way to do it. But I think we need to evolve, to your point, we need to evolve and really think about we've tried the worst things possible. I mean, I think zero tolerance is family separation, right? I feel we all can agree it was probably a rock bottom moment. And it didn't stop anything. So we need to kind of take a new approach and really think about, in order to manage the border in a way, you need to manage people and you need to have the right tools to be managing people and dealing with people, particularly when about 1/3 of them are children, right? I mean, the people is a huge percentage of them are kids. And so we want to make sure we're responding to them as kids, meeting them where they are and not treating them like little adults.
Oh, wow. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. This is really helpful to have some context kind of from your all's work on the ground and connecting to kids' stories and being involved. It's so helpful for us to have that context when we're reading headlines. Do you have any recommendations of how we might respond? We're all over the country, different places, but if you have words of wisdom for us, we'd love to know kind of what our next steps might be.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I mean, look, you all are incredibly powerful in, the advocacy and the conversations that you have. And I would say keep doing it. I think people, kind of average people who don't work in immigration law every day, speaking up about where their values are is really important, and giving a message to the administration, whoever is sitting in the White House, what you support and what is just not acceptable. If caging babies and putting them in family detention is something that you don't support, talking about the local level, making your voice heard, because, elected officials are listening because they want to stay in power. And so people being able to speak up, you don't have to know everything there is to know about immigration law to say, I don't think we should lock up families together. That is enough, right? Just like you all were very powerful in saying, we don't think you should take babies from their mothers. That was very powerful and helped lead to the end of that draconian policy. And so I think continuing to do that is really important. And I think it's going to be people like me relying on you all to really kind of set the bar on what the morals are. Where's the moral compass in our country? And setting drawing some lines in the sand on that. So I want to thank you for all that you've already have all done and continued support and care for these kids.
Oh, that's very encouraging. And I'll just say for anyone watching, we do have a free resource that's just called Using Your Voice, and it will really walk you through kind of what advocacy might look like for you, whether that's talking to someone in your family or leading a Bible study in your church or calling your elected officials. There's all kinds of different ways that you can use your voice. And sometimes it might feel scary or might be outside your comfort zone, but we want to equip you to act on your compassion. And this is one of the ways that you can do that. And so thank you so much again, Jennifer. It was such a delight to talk to you. And thank you guys for watching.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
This is where I try to figure out how to end it. Let me see.